previously mentioned, this ideal model of the research process is only one ideal, and there's more variation in types of research papers and purposes that research can serve than this model takes into account. So what we think of in this kind of framework is mostly rigid social science that tries to mirror the process in the natural sciences, where you start deductively with a theory, which then also says which method you should use, how you should measure it, how you should design your study, and so on. And then test the hypotheses that you derived from the theory. However, there's quite a number of social science paper genres, you could say. This is a little caricature of what kinds of sociology papers you could imagine. So from developing of new kinds of concepts, introducing complexities and complications of seemingly easy and solid and understandable things, theoretical schools that clash, epistemological schools that clash. So all these kinds of papers also do exist and don't necessarily always fit in this setup where you start with a motivating idea, collect relevant literature, find theoretical approaches that you want to use, arrive at hypotheses and research questions, which then guide your empirical study. That's one and a very important way of doing research, but it is certainly not the only one, particularly when you are more in the qualitative realm of research, and this feels unnecessarily rigid. So let's distinguish at least three major forms of typical research projects or research contributions that have different functions and therefore also different guiding ideas and guiding principles. So one kind of research objective would be the one that is closest to the ideal I just sketched, that I call a rigid testing study. So these would be studies devoted to rigid testing that have a very narrow scope on a very limited set of clearly defined dependent variables, so things you want to explain, where you want to find and identify the causes for, so the phenomena you want to explain, but also a very limited and clearly defined set of independent variables. So these define the relationship of interest between this limited set of dependent and independent variables. That means you need prior research that tells you which variables belong together and which make sense to study in this rigid kind of way. Potentially they can also include so-called third variables or intervening variables, of which there's three kinds. So-called control variables, variables that also contribute to explaining or a variation in the dependent variable that you need to consider in your explanation, but that you're not really interested in. So this is more or less noise that you want to remove from the data. but we also have mediating variables. These are variables that transmit the effect from the independent variable, the possible cause, to the dependent variable, so they mediate in between. So first, in a sense, the cause would first cause changes in the mediator, and then the mediator causes changes in the dependent variable. Okay? And then we have moderating variables, which are variables that kind of mix up how or change how the independent and the dependent variable relate to each other. For instance, if it's just a binary variable, a yes or no variable, for instance, if you have a high degree of education, then the link between your parents' household income and your voting decisions may be different than if you have a low degree of education. So the way the parental income shapes voting decisions depends on your level of education. For instance, you find a positive relationship between parental income and voting for and participating in an election if you have a low degree of education, but if you have a high degree of education, this relationship is no longer found. So that would be an example of a moderation. The variable changes the way x and y, the independent and the dependent variable, relate to each other, but in a predictable way. So there is rules. If the moderator has this value, then this happens, and if it has another value, something else happens, and we kind of know what it is. So this is all still part of the rigid testing. For your reference, I added a few ways in which independent and dependent variables can be called in different research contexts. So you may want to emphasize the time relation. Then you say the possible cause is the antecedent, so the thing that came before, and the effect would be the consequence. The dependency in the model is emphasized by the pair I used, independent versus dependent variable. If we focus on the predictive capacity, then we call the possible cause a predictor or a covariate, and the potential effect would be the criterion, the predicted variable, or the outcome. As mathematical science, we just say possible causes are x's and possible effects are y's. If we focus on mathematical modeling in regression, we call the potential causes the regressor and the effect the regressand. And if we focus on the explanatory function, we say it's the explanans or the explanatory variable. And when we talk about the cause, and if we talk about the effect, we say it's the response variable, the explained variable, or the explanandum, so the thing we want an explanation for. And if we think of this as a system, a cybernetic system, we could say the cause is an input and the effect is an output. Okay, different kinds of rigid testing would be meta-analysis, where you analyze tons of studies that examine this relationship between x and y and try to find a statistical measure of how strong the relationship between x and y really is based on many studies. So you're compiling based on a lot of evidence that already exists, which presupposes that there has been a lot of research going on. So all this rigid testing is usually done in very mature research fields that are studied over and over again. So you're not doing pioneering work usually, but you are contributing in a vivid environment with a lot of studies that are being published. You can, of course, also do a more traditional literature review of the relationship between X and Y, giving you a bit more leeway in weighing different kinds of evidence and saying this study is better than that one, so it should count more, and you usually don't come with a statistical measure, but more a qualitative assessment of how the relationship between X and Y is structured. But you can also think of studies, primary studies that test predictions between X and Y. So we have a highly developed theory and previous evidence trying to tap causality between X and Y. For instance, in experimental studies such as randomized trials in medicine and pharmaceutics. And yet another genre would be studies that add a bit of complexity to such an established research field. So you test intervening variables between X and Y, mediation and moderation relationships, but still you work within this established framework where a lot of research work has already been done. So this is most frequent in in research fields that have received a lot of attention already in the past. Then we have a second genre, which I call model building genre or stage. So these are research fields that are also mature in the sense that you don't generally pioneer this field, but there is not enough evidence that you can already say exactly which dependent variables and which independent variables really are at the heart of this phenomenon, what are the very limited number of relationships of interest. So we still have more options and a little less guidance as to what's the most important components. Therefore, one of the major things being done here is to explore correlations. So we have a set of relevant variables, but it's larger. Or they haven't been tested before, but you can anticipate or deduct from theory that it should play a role, or it's plausible, or somebody has uttered the suspicion that it may play a role. So we look at the correlation between several variables and check are they correlated or not, which can then motivate more rigid research once we know, okay, this set of variables seem to be associated with, say, depressive symptomatology, and we can go further and try to see if this is a causal relationship or not in this rigid testing approach. Okay. One step further already in that direction would be the development of predictive models. So you don't a priori specify these are the few variables that will play a role, so I put them into my model whatsoever, but you probably just want to test is a minimum model for predicting unemployment status, for instance, already enough, or do I need a more complex model that includes more possible explanatory factors? Right. So again, we move towards finding out which are the factors that are of crucial importance and that need to be studied and can be examined to tap causality later on. A bit earlier in the research process, you may want in this model building stage to find very good and robust measurements for the phenomena that you want to study. So this is both on the dependent and independent variable side, that you want rigid measurements that replicate well, that are high in validity and reliability. So for instance, you have collected 6 different indicators of optimism, straight optimism in your study, and 6 indicators of satisfaction with life, and want to check, do I need all of them? Is it sufficient to have a few of them, or can, if I collect all of them, can I sum them up into an index of some sort, or not? So mapping variables to dimensions and building operationalizations, robust measurement instructions. That is also an important part of this model building stage. And similarly, pre-structuring the data that you have by trying to find classes or clusters of units, of cases. So not looking at the variables only and seeing which variables describe the cases, but taking the cases along a set of relevant variables and see, are there clusters where cases are similar to each other. For instance, here we study countries and the professional norms that journalists subscribe to, their role conceptions of what it means to be a journalist. And there, for instance, we see relatively strong geographical clusters, where one cluster would be European and Northern American journalists, basically. One cluster more frequently found in Africa, or another being relatively typical of Southern America. Right? So that's also a way of pre-structuring, not by saying these variables are similar to these other variables, but by saying these cases are similar to these cases and they form a type, and you build a typology of, in this case, of journalists' role conceptions. Related to the map variables to dimensions, genre would be the subgenre of validating measurement instruments. So you want, for instance, test the criterion validity of a certain measurement, or its reliability, or several dimensions of validity that we will talk about in the measurement section, so stay tuned for that. Another part would be what I call closed-ended exploration. So this means that we try to discover empirical patterns based on a set of potentially relevant variables and possible or suspected mechanisms. We build typologies or suggest additional or alternative concepts, pinpoint conceptual gaps and blind spots. This is also where qualitative evidence comes in more often, and it becomes more relevant in this genre of closed-ended exploration. Finally, we have open-ended exploration. This is the very pioneering stages where a new phenomenon comes up, or gains an established phenomenon gains in importance or perceived importance, and suddenly scientific interest increases. So here, first steps are to even identify what would be relevant aspects of the phenomenon that later on could be viewed as variables. We want to exhaust concepts, see how things manifest and express themselves. Maybe consulting experts and their opinions who can showcase. We want to contextualize relationships using case studies, see what happens in specific situations and in specific settings around the phenomenon. We can think of pilot studies that try out a novel research design, or we want to reconstruct subjective experience, interpretations, and sense making. So this is where qualitative research is almost exclusively done, or is at least the most important in all of these research approaches. Also very important in closed-ended exploration. And then as research fields mature, the importance of quantitative evidence increases. But we shouldn't think of this as a natural development in a research field from purely qualitative to purely quantitative inquiry. Even in this rigid testing stage, where we have a strongly developed research field already, with clearly defined independent and dependent variables, all kinds of theorizing and so on, you can come in with a qualitative study and question some of these things that quantitative researchers who do rigid testing take for granted. So they will probably not always update how do you measure depressive symptomatology. Is this still adequate in, say, the age of social media to ask about television, right? Sometimes you are so deep into this rigid testing and in kind of obeying all the demands of this rigid test from previous research that it's easy to overlook changes or shortcomings. And this is where qualitative research also can come in and show certain patterns or observations that seem to question how we measure things, whether behind these correlations or relationships, the mechanisms that we think are behind them are really behind them. Use the subjective experience of people to question some of these scientific interpretations, where we scientists may also have a tendency to impose our interpretations on phenomena that we observe, rather than listening to the ones who are involved. But on the other hand, those who are involved also not always have the correct interpretation, I'm sure. So this is something one needs to discuss, of course, and that needs to be discursively